I thought I would begin with a few words about why we put this session together. So, the Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard wrote, "The future doesn't exist. It's what we make it." And I think these are hopeful words, but they also hold a lot of responsibility. And we live in a time when few people have the lion's share of power and privilege. And as we consider how to make a positive future that works for people and for the natural systems on which we depend, and of course, as we've talked a lot about this week, which depend on us, we have to rethink power and privilege. We have to forge new paths that reimagine connections with nature and shift the balance of power and privilege through deep listening, through perspective shifting, through empathy, and through pioneering new, and importantly, rekindling old ways of knowing. In this session, we're going to explore the reciprocal relationship between people and nature through a lens of equity, justice, and biocultural values. I can think of no better way to close out the plenaries of this amazing week. So we're going to hear from 5 accomplished speakers and then close with a panel discussion, possibly accompanied by some electronica beats. So our first speaker is Dr. Khalid Osman, who is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering here at Stanford. His research focuses on the this is a hard word to say, operationalization of equity and justice in the provision of infrastructure services, specifically employing qualitative and quantitative methods to develop novel frameworks at the intersection of the natural, built, and social environment. He leads his lab to develop new approaches to equitable and just infrastructure in a world where climate change challenges vulnerable communities every day. Khalid.
Thank you, Anne, for that amazing introduction. I appreciate it. And including me in sort of putting this session together. I think it took several months of work, and it's exciting to see it all come together, and excited to be amongst an amazing panel here today. And so, as Anne said, I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering, and my work really focuses on how do we marry social systems and technical systems together to really create innovations and solutions that benefit communities for more sustainable futures. And so today I wanted to talk about one piece of that, one aspect of that, which is community-engaged approaches and what that means to me. And so just a little bit about my background. If you would like to contact me, I run Osman Lab, and my email is there as well, but I'll skip through this. And jump right into it, right? We don't have a ton of time up here, and I want to have a lot of time for questions. But how do we think about supporting community-engaged approaches when we're thinking about research? And so the acceleration of community-driven solutions really needs investments in tools and resources to amplify the voices and ideas of frontline communities. They're the ones most impacted by climate change and environmental hazards. And so 3 ways I think we can do this really quickly in terms of building capacity at community organizations. Oftentimes we're asking community organizations to work with us as researchers, to work with us as agencies, without realizing that they themselves don't have the capacity or resources to do that. And so I really focus on improving access to resources in my research, and then how do we educate on best practices, both for researchers and understanding where communities are coming from, but also for communities to understand where researchers are coming from. And then the last piece of there is enhancing data capacity, making sure that the data that we process and generate is not just going to waste or sitting on a shelf or sitting in a research paper, but is actually benefiting the community in a way that they can understand and grasp. I call these the 5 V's for collaborations with community-based organizations, which a lot of my research focuses on. The first one is vision alignment, making sure that you have a shared vision and aligned goals and partnerships. The second one is versatility. Communities and community partners are often changing. As I mentioned, capacity building is a process, it's dynamic. And so that requires, on behalf of us as researchers and as agencies, to really think about how can we be versatile in engaging with communities and adapting to their needs. The last one is the third one is validation, making sure that we have clear metrics, right? We can throw out all of these fancy words, we can throw out all of these fancy models, but if we're not measuring our success in engaging with communities with clear metrics, then we're just perpetuating existing injustices that have gone on for far too long. Now, the fourth one there is vibrant communication, making sure that we're communicating in ways that foster really transparent and consistent communications among collaborators, and then value, right? Making sure that we're valuing people's opinions equally, and that we are thinking about ways that we can take knowledge from communities and use it for the things that we need to do so that we can give that knowledge back to them, and also sharing space equally. On this slide, I really want to focus on the last two here, which is collaboration with policymakers. So how do we take community engaged research and actually implement it? I think collaboration with policymakers has to happen early. We can't wait until the end to try and collaborate with policymakers. And then the last one there is continual assessing for impact and implemented policies. I find oftentimes that as researchers, we go into communities, we develop all of these cool new things that help us advance our own careers, but we're not measuring if that success has actually helped that community benefit over time. And so how do we continue to go back and assess success in that metric? I'm going to skip over this slide. It's sort of a three-step approach that I like to do, but I know that I am short on time, and so I'm going to jump right into it and focus on a few studies that I've done and that have been successful in using a community-engaged approach. The first one here was with the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. We're working with rural Alabama communities, Lowndes County, to implement a community-engaged approach to fixing sanitation failure in the area. And you can see here's the team. You might be familiar with Catherine Flowers if you've read her book. She's the director and executive for CREEJ. And the rest of the team is there with researchers and other partners. If you don't know Lowndes County, it's in the Black Belt area of Alabama. Alabama has this Black Belt for two reasons. One is that they have really rich clayey soils there that are great for agriculture, and those soils are black. The problem with clayey soils, as we know, climate change is continuously challenging us in different ways. In this area, they're dealing with flooding. And if you have a community that's mostly relying on septic systems for their sanitation infrastructure, and you pair that with flooding, we know that sanitation infrastructure, especially septic tanks, can't sit in the ground when flooding is making everything come up. And so this is a picture of somebody's backyard. I think the quote that Catherine uses in her book is, we're wallowing in our own waste, right? A flood comes through, not only does it ruin the septic system itself, but it spreads all of the contaminants from that septic system across the entire community and neighborhood, affecting children and adults equally. Here are just some more pictures from the study that we did last summer. We're continuing to work with them, but just different types of what people resort to when their systems fail. On the right side, you have a straight pipe system, which takes all of the waste from a home and dumps it into a ditch in the backyard. And the other one is what happens when that floods. And so our community engagement in this project was multi-pronged. We did focus groups, we're doing surveys, and then our final goal for all of this is to really understand how can we implement solutions that are informed by the community themselves that will be sustainable for the long term. And so we initially started with focus groups. Really, we wouldn't have had access to the community without our community partner. CREEJ was instrumental in getting us to have the trust of the community, which is extremely important when working with communities, and I think you'll hear that through all of our presentations today. We sort of found several different impacts that we wouldn't have found if we were just looking for quantitative measures. It really took going in and talking to people and figuring out what are the qualitative measures for understanding sanitation, how complex sanitation is in a place like rural Alabama. One of the quotes there you see at the bottom that came up is that they have these air property laws, which means that any changes you try to make to the property has to be approved by all of the people who are on that deed. And for some people, they said that, there's folks who have died, folks who don't live near us, folks who would be really hard to reach. And so even if we came up with the most technically sound solution, it wouldn't have been able to be implemented because of the social barrier that exists there. We also visited homes to collect samples and test water quality, both in the soils and the water. I have a minute left. Let me just zoom through this. What we found there, if I can go back for a second, we did find fecal waste and testing sites near homes. We also are testing schools and playgrounds and just other recreational areas to see if the waste from homes are spreading across entire communities. And those results are forthcoming. I wanted to talk another project that we're working on. When I think about environmental justice, I think about it in two ways. One is environmental injustice and the harm that has been done on communities. The other aspect is how are communities benefiting from technological improvements and environmental benefit, right? You know, if those things that we are developing now are not benefiting communities, then we're continuing to perpetuate injustice. And so this is a project in Houston where I think we all know Houston is dealing with flooding, and they were hit with another storm last week that was devastating. But we're working with disadvantaged communities in Houston through our partner Bayou City Waterkeepers to try and understand what are the barriers to implementing nature-based solutions to flooding in these communities. They've long been neglected when it comes to nature-based solutions. And so we did that through focus groups. We're still working through all the data. We're hoping to develop a survey. But you can see here are some of the findings. And I love to say that my research sort of lives through quotes. I love taking anecdotal data and thinking about how we can apply that into our sort of more quantitative approaches. One of the positive responses to a green stormwater infrastructure implementation there says, you know, it's very deep within our DNA to appreciate green space. One of the concerns was that, you know, you want to come into somebody's community, tell them what to do, and you are not there for more than 30 minutes. It becomes really challenging to get the community to trust you. And so last point here from Donella Meadows, amazing environmental scientist. The highest point of leverage to intervene in any system is always mindset. And so how do we shift our mindset, you know, towards a more community-engaged approach so that communities are benefiting from all the things that we talk about when it comes to sustainability? So I'm looking forward to all of your questions during the panel, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalid. So excited about this session. Next up, we have Dr. Andrea Baudoin Farah. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability at Colorado State University. There, she leads the TRILAR Lab, which stands for Transformations of Rural and Indigenous Livelihoods, Lands, and Autonomous Regimes, and is the co-director of the Just Social-Ecological Transitions in Latin America program. Previously, she was a postdoctoral scholar with NatCap and continues to work with us in Bolivia, trying to understand and communicate the impacts of land use change and climate change on livelihoods and ecosystem services. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's wonderful to share with this wonderful panel and with the audience. And I apologize for reading, but I had to write it all to make sure that I stay on time. So today I would like to share some thoughts about the importance of how we think about Indigenous peoples and territories in conservation or nature-based solution efforts, and to make the case for centering Indigenous livelihoods, rights, and aspirations in the way we produce science to invest more in just sustainable future. First, I think it is important to recognize that we are gathered today in the traditional lands of the Muwekmao'olone people, and I will be more broadly speaking about the unceded lands of Indigenous peoples across the Americas, or Abya-Yala. Land acknowledgements can be empty exercises if they are not based on reciprocity, or if there is no further conversation about the implications of our colonial past and our colonial present. And as a non-Indigenous scholar, who has been working with Indigenous peoples in the Bolivian lowlands for almost 10 years, I want to emphasize that I do not intend to speak for my partners or other Indigenous peoples, but rather share some thoughts that are coming to inform my work in terms of finding my role in working alongside Indigenous peoples to support their reivindications. And this is something that I struggle with on a weekly basis, to try to figure out what my role is coming from the privilege that I come from. Land collectively owned by Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and local communities has increased over recent decades, which is a good thing. In 2020, it accounted for 11.4% of global lands, and in Latin America, the percentage reaches 17%, which is the highest of any region in the world. But despite progress in the formal granting of rights, there remain not only vast unanswered claims to land, but also multiple challenges to Indigenous self-determination in those lands due to the pressures of extractivism in and around these territories, but also the imposition of hegemonic development models. And those hegemonic models can also come from sustainable development or conservation efforts. The positive relationship between increased property rights for Indigenous peoples and conservation outcomes has been proven again and again, as you can see in that image. However, the way in which we understand and frame those relationships is important, and it is not neutral. If we think about Indigenous peoples only as crucial stakeholders for the conservation agenda, without considering their multiplicity of aspirations and livelihood strategies, we risk undermining Indigenous self-determination the second they challenge our assumptions or conflict with conservation efforts. Indigenous peoples' life projects and well-being conceptions are diverse and dynamic, and while Indigenous land stewardship does tend to align with conservation efforts, supporting tenure security and self-determination processes for Indigenous peoples is first and foremost an issue of justice in the face of historic and ongoing processes of dispossession. From that perspective, centering Indigenous peoples' prerogatives and aspirations in our work should be a priority, and transdisciplinary research can be a useful framework to guide those efforts, and through best principles and best practices, as Khalid mentioned, that are constantly adapted and improved upon and that we can learn from. Transdisciplinary research can be understood as a reflective process that brings together perspectives from different disciplines, but also partnerships beyond academia to co-create research goals and develop solutions, which is nothing new to this audience. In practice, this means, for example, co-designing research questions, methods, data management protocols, or rethinking how authorship is attributed. There are teams who are doing an amazing job at this, and we can learn a lot from them. I consider that I'm on the path to doing such work, always learning. And at the Just Social-Ecological Transitions in Latin America program at Colorado State University, it's a new program that I'm co-directing, and it's only a year old. We have been fostering a space to exchange and learn from these approaches, and I'm happy to talk more about that during the panel if you wish to do so, but I'm gonna move along just because we don't have a lot of time. For now, I just want to share a quick example of work that was carried out here at NatCap with various other institutions from the Llanos de Mojos working group, folks who you can see in the picture. The Llanos de Mojos is the biggest wetland in the Amazon basin. It is also home to 18 different indigenous groups, and it is, as many other regions, subject to mounting pressures from the expansion of the agricultural frontier. Hoping to generate decision-relevant information for local stakeholders about the potential impacts of the agricultural expansion, NatCap developed a methodology that integrated priorities, visions, and aspirations of different stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples, in the modeling of different land use scenarios and their trade-offs. We used participatory methods to identify people's stated desires for the future and integrate them in our scenario modeling. The result is a nuanced picture of possible transformations and impacts in which who owns the land and what they want to do with it varies greatly across this vast region. While our project was not completely transdisciplinary in the sense of research co-development and co-creation, we did integrate several elements of that framework. And with that, I knew it. I'm sure I'm almost over time. So any questions that you have about that project, we can talk more during the panel. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andrea. Next up, we have Dr. Jade Delevaux, who's a senior scientist at Seascape Solutions and a senior fellow at NatCap. Trained as a geographer, her work focuses on the effects of global changes on coupled human-natural systems in tropical environments, in case you're too cold in this air-conditioned room. She works to advance applied research on natural capital approaches and to develop capacity to empower local partners to use natural capital approaches in the Pacific and Caribbean regions. Please come up, Jade. And Jade is not going to be able to stay for the whole panel, so in case she sneaks out, I'm going to give her a hug. Safe travels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Such an honor to be on this panel. So today I'm going to talk about how natural capital approach can be used as tools to inform biocultural restoration. So Pacific Islands have, a lot of them have a volcanic origin, so very porous geology. And they're also exposed to steep gradients of rainfall that carve steep relief in the watersheds. And on the ocean side, we're exposed to high and strong seasonal swell that can carve the reefs that surround us. So due to our small sizes and steep gradients, land and sea are tightly connected through social and ecological processes, which can take multiple pathways, which goes to one of the questions we had in the previous session about how to incorporate or consider land and sea connections in how we manage our natural assets. So traditionally, Pacific Islanders manage the land and the sea as one ecological unit, such as the Moku system in Hawaii. Communities and governments today seek to restore this approach to secure resources and reaffirm Indigenous rights, as well as knowledge and practices. So I'm going to tell you two stories today. One from the Cook Islands, where we're working with local leaders in terms of like sharing how natural capital approaches can be used to help restore this kind of land-sea integrated approach. So the Muri Lagoon, which is on Rarotonga, and for those who were here on Monday, we heard from our partners here that it plays a very important role for tourism. First, tourism is 75% of the GDP for Cook Islands, and that is the case for a lot of Pacific Islands. And 25% of the tourism passing through the Cook Islands actually go and stay in the Muri Lagoon. So as a result of this high tourism, there's an increase in coastal development happening on the watersheds, which increase impervious surfaces, which then can result in increasing flood risk because the water doesn't get to seep through into the ground. With it also comes sediment and nutrient runoff, which can result in large algae bloom, which have been shown to even impact the health of the people who recreate in those places. So to address this challenge, a team of us got together, which includes local government leaders from the Environment and Finance Ministry, the Asian Development Bank, and the NatCap team. And our goal is to develop capacity around natural capital approaches so the local leaders can apply those tools in their own ways and inform how can we balance development and secure the benefits of the Muri Lagoon. So we had our first workshop back in March where we looked at introducing those approaches and looking at how they've been applied in other similar places geographically. We also got together with local business owners, local NGO, community members to map the benefits that the Muri Lagoon provides, and as well as where are the risks coming from, with the ultimate goal of co-designing nature-based solutions to mitigate flooding and restore marine water quality. So this is what came out of this participatory mapping effort, which helped highlight what are the source of the challenges, and that could be targeted nature-based solutions, and where are and what are the benefits at risk. So now we're in the phase where we're co-developing a natural capital assessment through virtual training to assess what are the potential nature-based solutions that could be used and assess what would be the benefits of, for instance, restoring riparian buffers or protecting wetlands from being developed. We're also looking at financing a local NGO to implement those nature-based solutions, and we're looking at going back next year to also assess how those nature-based solutions are performing. So going beyond the modeling all the way to implementation. The hope is, through this small pilot, the hope is to end this partnership, is to help mobilize resources, attract more resources to this beautiful place, to help secure the benefits of their natural capital assets for local residents and tourism and tourists, now and into the future. My second story takes place in Hawaii, where I spent many years of my life, another place very dear to my heart. It's a place of cultural renaissance, where the state has committed to several sustainable development goals. The first one is developing, doubling local food production by 2030, protecting 30% of their watershed and nearshore area, helping boost a green workforce and create smart sustainable community by restoring connection to place. To achieve this, local communities and governments are looking at biocultural restoration, which is a process that seeks to revive connections between humanity and nature through caring for places. And they're trying to do this from summit to sea, which is aligned with the customary management, the Moku system. So traditionally, Hawaiians would manage from the ridge to the reef, and the ridges were sacred places that were often kapu. You couldn't access them. And the midland of the watersheds is where the agriculture system were, and the reefs were a place for gathering and recreation. So today the state is doing, in partnership with local landowners, is looking at protecting native forests in those ridges through fencing, while the midlands, although they used to be places where traditional OEV agriculture were very abundant and has been shown to even support support food production that could sustain the population that we have today, which is more than 1 million people. Unfortunately, after colonization, those lands were converted to large sugar and pineapple plantation, which today, after they became economically unviable, they became fallow agriculture land, which are colonized by alien grasses. And the problem with those grasslands and those abandoned plantations today is that they fuel wildfire. And we saw last year that we had one of the most deadly wildfire in West Maui. And after the dry season passes, we get the strong rains that then washes all the sediment down on the reef and put our fisheries at risk. So a team of us got together to look at how can we inform this biocultural restoration. And the first, with 3 goals in mind. The first one was to assess how can native forest protection provide benefits through fencing, explore what is the feasibility of restoring those indigenous food production system through interviews, mapping, and demonstration sites, and then evaluate what are the benefits that could emerge from restoring those kind of systems from reach to reef. And this is what we found. By mapping forest protection and benefits through fencing, we saw that we can increase groundwater recharge, which is our main source of drinking water. We can mitigate wildfire by 50% and enhance the protection of native forest species. Through demonstration sites and interviews with biocultural practitioners, we saw that communities can transform landscapes where we have invasive species to very diverse landscapes that are culturally grounded, that can also provide diverse and healthy food systems for local food consumption. And we also saw that native and culturally important plant could be restored in less than 2 years. We also found that through our reach to reef assessment, that restoring those systems on land could help triple sediment retention across the landscapes, increase annual fish catch by up to 60% in some places, preserve species that have spiritual meaning for local communities, and also create a green workforce where people are caring for places. So, the other benefits that are less tangible but as important is that by restoring and maintaining those systems, we can preserve knowledge and practices that can be passed down to the next generation. One of the fabric of social networks in the Pacific is sharing food, and by maintaining those food systems, we can support those social interactions, which have been shown to make communities more resilient also in time of COVID. We are preserving species that have spiritual meaning, and we can support physical and mental well-being. So the restoration of indigenous food system and the protection of local biodiversity can build island resilience in an equitable fashion. But both of those interventions at large scale require finance, and how can we design finance mechanism that can be based on the co-produced benefit by nature and people. And based on the analogy that our world is an island, where land and water, people and nature are inseparable, what can we learn? Well, islands are the ultimate lab for climate change adaptation. They're also the breeding ground for the green revolution that we need. We can start with pilots and then scale them up to the rest of the world. It's also a place where we can show that healing people and places can happen relatively fast. We're seeing results in less than 2 years. And it's also teaching us that our ability to thrive in the face of changes that we're facing today at the global scales, it lies in our connections to each other, our communities, our ancestral roots, and the nature that supports us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jade. Andre and Fred and I can do, and Lavinia can do our best to answer any questions you might have about the Cook Islands. Our next speaker is Elliot White Jr., who is an assistant professor of Earth System Science in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. He's a coastal ecosystem scientist who leverages his domain expertise in wetland sciences with interdisciplinary training in remote sensing and eco-hydrology to investigate climate change-related challenges on coastal socio-ecological systems. He has ongoing research projects that are partnering with community-based organizations to leverage wetlands as a form of flood protection, create access points to carbon markets, and develop an equity-focused coastal hazard emergency preparedness platform. To tell us more about all of that, I'd like to welcome Elliot White.
All right, thank you all for having me. I'm going to go through this quickly, but it'll be fun all together. So in my research group, we have two fundamental questions. One of those is primarily ecology-based, which is how are coastal land ecological integrity and continuity being disrupted by global climate change? And the second question that's more relevant today is, what are the inequities that marginalized coastal communities face due to the impacts of global climate change? So we know very well that extreme precipitation frequency and magnitude are increasing due to climate change, and that's the case under many different warming scenarios. And it's really relevant when we think about flood exposure and how a lot of the flooding that we experience in the US in particular is driven by precipitation, whether it be rain falling in the watershed and causing rivers to swell, or just water falling in place and not having adequate drainage. And that exposure is going to increase, or the number of people exposed to flooding is going to increase over time. And historically marginalized communities are expected to experience the bulk of that flooding. And this is a concerning trend when we really think about the demographics of our coastal communities, and they tend to be much more racially diverse than the interior of our country. Flood mitigation can happen through adaptation, particularly natural adaptation, but more often than not, we tend to focus on gray infrastructure. So there are passive barriers like levees that we can build, or there are active systems that we can implement like pumping systems. So these two images from New Orleans, my hometown, are two ways that cities are trying to adapt to flooding, but they often carry these very expensive costs with them. In turn, we can think about the role that nature can play in this critical challenge. So nature-based solutions are one of those things, with wetlands. Wetlands are near and dear to my heart, being one way that we can address that. And wetlands do this amazing thing for us, absolutely for free. They hold on to water, and they tend to hold on to it for a long time and not immediately release it back into the surrounding environment. And so wetlands definitely stole my heart. That image is from one of my first field excursions in grad school in summer of 2015, so 9 years ago. You can't see it, but just below where that picture cuts off is where the water starts. So at about my waist, so I'm standing at about 3 feet of water, but having the time of my life. But the image on the right really shows you how wetlands work in the landscape and how they influence hydrology. So you have these huge rainstorms and you have runoff. Wetlands tend to be at low points in the landscape, so water flows to them. And because of the fact that they can hold on to water, they increase the amount of time that the water sits in one spot. When you think about an urban system, however, water falls into the landscape and it immediately moves, which is why we have flash flooding in cities, but you don't really think about flash flooding in the forest because there's a high amount of permeability and storage capacity. So a lot of my research recently has focused on maps, and I have started to do that because I think about maps as an access point for collaboration and for sharing. So all of you, most of you have a smartphone in your pocket, or you flew here. At some point, you looked at a map to get here. So we all have this very intuitive sense of maps and how to relate ourselves to something on the landscape. And so I tend to put my ecological findings in a mapped context. And that mapped context can help to, as I said, increase collaboration. So not just ecological data, socioeconomic data, political, policy data, demographic data, all of those things can be mapped and viewed spatially. And so now we can start to layer those and interact with people and start to co-locate ourselves with different problems, different things on the landscape. And so going into the research that we're doing, Hurricane Harvey happened in 2017 and had a significant impact on the city of Houston. I had some research going on in Beaumont at the time, which is a city in East Texas on the Neches River. I had some groundwater wells. Those wells showed a 6-meter amount of water sitting in a forest. And that forest right across from it is a neighborhood, is a golf course. So there were 6 meters of water just sitting on the landscape. And so this is a imagery from the suburbs of Houston of a city that doesn't look like a city, it looks more like Atlantis. And in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, there was some polling done through research to ask people, what would you like to see in terms of flood mitigation? And if you look at all the options below, none of them suggest anything related to nature-based solutions. They're all policy instruments or traditional engineering structures, and they all have very high support. The y-axis starts at 60% and goes up to some of them getting 95% or plus. But when you think about Houston, it's nicknamed the Bayou City. Bayous are a type of wetland, but if you go and visit Houston, you see a lot of gray, you see a lot of pavement. And when you look at this figure, we're showing that between 2011 and 2019 alone, Houston launched a huge amount of wetlands, much of that going to development, and some of it going to open water. And there was some gain in wetlands, but not enough to offset the significant losses in that time period. And so I developed a project with Khalid Osman, Diana Mwanga, who is a huge part of this work, in addition to our community partners, Bayou City Waterkeepers. And just very briefly, the executive director, I met haphazard at a concert, or not a concert, there's a concert that's gonna be happening later on. Go check it out, it's a good artist. But I was at a conference, a conference, just randomly sat at the table. I'm a friendly person. I just strike up a conversation. She mentioned she's part of this group. At the time, I had really nothing research-wise, but as these questions started to turn over in my head, I thought, oh, I know someone in Houston. Let me email them, and then that led to this. All right, 1 minute, good. And so what we're trying to do is work with communities to understand, one, what's their baseline understanding of nature-based solutions and how willing they are to actually implement those. And part of that is to do some of that wetland modeling work to show and to demonstrate that if we bring wetlands back onto the landscape, we could have a quantifiable impact on flooding in the Houston area. And so some of the preliminary data, we're still churning through all of it. We generated way more data than we thought we would. It's 1 billion rows, which I've never worked with a data set that large. But we're using a NatCap model here. And what we're showing on the left and on the right is the water retention on the landscape under 2 different design storms. So a 1-year storm, which is a storm that you may expect to happen in any given year, and a 500-year storm, which Hurricane Harvey was. The more blue that you see indicates a greater amount of water being held in the landscape. And we compare the left and the right, you see that the left is more blue, it's less water falling onto the landscape, so you can retain more in any given pixel. But in extreme events, the landscape can't hold as much water. But you will see that there are still some really blue areas, and all of those really blue areas are wetlands. And another kind of half of this research is led by Khalid over here, where we're going out to the community and doing that engagement. And Khalid showed some of those survey results. And I want to say this is my very first time doing community engaged research. And so that the picture on the bottom left is the first time I've ever been part of a focus group. And I came back from that in my first group meeting, and I told my students, like, this was probably the most exhilarating thing I've ever done as a scientist. And I've spent a lot of time in wetlands, waist deep, as I showed. But this was really fun because it was the first time where I had read about something and gone to people and they were saying those exact things. And there was a purity to that that I had never gotten in research before. And so with all of that, continue to diversify the sciences, take sustained progress, but we'll get there if we all work together. Thank you all. Excuse me.
Thank you, Elliot. You should try combining those too. Do your community engaged research with the waders on in the wetlands. Okay, last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Selomane, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria. He's a sustainability scientist who studies aspects of systems linking society and the natural environment. He currently leads projects on developing sustainability indices, assessing the potential transformation of food systems towards sustainability outcomes, and developing tools and approaches to guide investments for natural solutions. Odi.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to be talking today about what we are missing when we choose to measure some things and not others. And to start, I wanted to talk about what we account for in assessments for natural capital, for ecosystems, for ecosystem services, that we want to know how much and where, or how well we're conserving nature. We want to know how, what benefits we're deriving from it. And we also want to know what risks can emerge from how nature is changing. So out of this three, I'll be focusing on the bit in the middle about how we are accounting for benefits derived from nature. And here showing the difference between the focus on the more common matrices, as well as some more nuanced matrices that you're not able to get from land use and land cover data, or the traditional ways that we use to account for ecosystems. So to elaborate a bit further on this is that we typically use sort of three, or what I'd like to think as three different matrices to assess these benefits. So on the one hand, we want to understand the availability or the extent of ecosystems and their conditions using matrices that people are using a lot here. And then we had yesterday as well, actually throughout this week, about sort of monetary valuation as another way to express how these benefits can be accounted for. And finally, what I think is direct use matrices. And here we're mainly interested in independence. And so the point that I'd like to make in this talk is that the direct use matrices are typically missing from our assessments of nature, of ecosystems, of ecosystem benefits, particularly because we are mostly expressing potential of what these ecosystems are providing for people. And so what those look like are representing the experiences people are having. They're representing how dependent they are on these ecosystems, as well as the perceptions of how people experience the landscapes. So because Anne said I should talk about equity, so I'm framing the implications of these, of missing this direct uses in terms of equity, which I'll get into in the next two or three slides. But essentially, the point of this is that these direct uses of nature are quite significant in areas where people still depend directly on natural ecosystems for basic services. So in most contexts, people don't think about nature being a source of energy or as a source of food, because we get that indirectly through agriculture. And so in these instances, this reliance or dependence on nature directly is quite important, and tends to be missing from our assessments. What we found in using the national census data in South Africa is that we are able to sort of start demonstrating how we can get to some of these direct uses, the perceptions of ecosystem dependence and quality. So just show you some examples of what this look like, that these are able to be expressed, especially as you can see in a paper that a colleague of ours did a few years ago. But we're not only able to express them at a point in time, but also able to express them over time. So the information is available out there to do this, but my worry at least is that this kinds of information can or cannot make it into natural capital assessments, depending on how, depending on whether we are considering this as part of what we should be measuring. So I'm going to talk about that implication of this based on this framework of equity dimensions, which talks about equity from a distributional perspective, from a procedural perspective, as well as from a recognition perspective. So in terms of recognition, if we aren't recognizing that these benefits and uses are out there, we won't be able to measure them. So we can't measure things that we don't recognize. And recognition equity predominantly focuses on values and norms and basically accounting for what people understand and value about the local environment. In terms of procedure, here that once we have recognized these values as existing, we will be able to represent them in decision making. So you can think about this as, when we think about equity, we think about equity from things should be distributed from one place to the next. But before we get there, we need to first recognize that these things exist, represent them in decision making, and only then can we get to talking about distribution. So with this, I just wanted to highlight that if we're thinking about this orange slice as the entirety of what nature's contributions could be like, at the moment we're representing a slice of that in accounts and in assessments, but there's a missing part that's not currently represented in this. And for that to make it into this assessment, it needs to be recognized, brought into decision making, and then considered for distribution purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Odi. We're going to transition to a panel discussion, and Khalid is going to help me moderate the panel since we put this together. And maybe you want to ask the first question, and then maybe I'll do one, and then we'll open it up. So start thinking about what questions you might want to ask our distinguished panel, please.
Oh, it's on my shirt. I completely forgot. The person back there did a great job of doing that. I wanted to ask a question about co-design and co-develop. I think everyone talked about it a little bit in their presentations. What are some of the, I think we all talked about the positives of co-design and co-production. But I was curious, just as a conversation, what are some of the challenges to that, right? And how do we think about overcoming some of the challenges to co-design, co-production? And I'm happy to have anyone jump in.
I can go first. I'll say the challenge for me, and as I said, this is the first time I've ever done something like this. It's there are different outcomes that I think groups want, and so as an academic, like my currency is publishing, it's papers, and there's a certain timeline and a certain way that you go about doing that. But for a community-based organization, they have a different set of outcomes. And so I think the challenge that I've had is how do we make sure that we're both kind of getting an outcome that we want? And we have a shared goal, but we have maybe different metric or different tangible things that we want from it. How do we ensure that everyone's getting what they want out of an experience while also not forcing anyone to compromise? And I think that's been my biggest challenge as someone who wasn't trained to do this, but has kind of thrown themselves into it. But I'd say the way that I've gone about it is just be very transparent about what I'm expecting out of this and what I'm able to contribute, and hope for the same transparency back. And that way we can have a continual dialogue to ensure that no one's intentionally having something left behind that they want, or maliciously having something left behind that they want. So I think just that transparency and understanding that we may have some differences, but we can still work together and work through those.
Yeah, well, to add to that, I completely agree. I think transparency and setting expectations is very important. And it's a process that takes time. And I think it takes showing up again and again to build trust. And I would say, at least in the work that I do, I have found that committing to people and place is important. And that requires, instead of thinking about spending your sabbatical in a new, exotic, fun place, going back to where you've been going for the past 10 years, even though it's not as exciting, you have to build those relationships and to work with people on the long term. And that can be a challenge also in terms of the innovation aspect, of the kind of innovation imperative of doing science and the fast pace of research. And yeah, just setting even if you think you have shared goals, I don't think that is, making sure that it's really the case or that you're meaning the same thing, like digging a little deeper in terms of what really is that people want is not necessarily simple. Because of the power asymmetries, sometimes people tend to not express fully what they want or challenge you or the agenda that you're coming with, and building those relationships takes time. Yeah. Academia is not very amenable to this kind of work.
So I don't have a question. I don't have an answer to that. But I think what I can say to it is that I think for the kind of work or the kind of concerns that we're dealing with, where there's very normative ways of we know the problems are, we know where we potentially want to go. I think it's for me it's more a question of, in a way it's not a question of whether you collaborate, you co-produce or not. I think that almost should be the basis, and we should be figuring out how to do it, rather than saying. I mean, it is challenging, of course. I'm not saying that it's not, but I think the focus should be, if things are going to change, that should be, this is something that needs to be done, and how do we do it? I think spending more time figuring out how to do co-production, I think for me that would be key.
Can I have a follow-up, or not a follow-up question, but a second question? That I think in all of the presentations we talked about land use, right, Elliot? You talked about wetlands changing to developed lands, and you talked about indigenous lands and changing the use of the land. I'm curious, how do we think about balancing land use change and development, right? Development is almost necessary to shelter and to house people and to have infrastructure, at least from my perspective. But I'm curious what you all think in terms of that balance of how much nature do we keep versus how much do we develop? And maybe it's not a how much question, but how do we think about that question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I'm glad I'm glad it's not a how much question anymore, because I think that's a much harder question to talk to. But I think for me a lot of the conversation at some point was, here is development and here's environment for a long time, and we spent too much time trying to say this is important, this is important. I think for me that time has passed where these things have come much closer together, in a way that there are ways to do development in a way that it doesn't need to be separated from environment. So from that perspective, I think there's been an important shift over the last 10 years or so, from this conversation of pitting these two things together to seeing them being much more aligned, in a way that, people talk about nature-based solution. Before that, we're talking about ecosystem-based adaptation. So nature is now coming more into the conversation of as a collaborator for development, rather than as something that we should be trying to avoid as we develop.
Yeah, I can briefly add, and so I think it's more about integration as being kind of reference. I do like the idea of still having, like, okay, this is nature and we never touch that. So I like the kind of American approach to conservation and preservation and setting lands aside. But I think what we need to do more is integrating nature back into some of these landscapes. And so nature-based solutions with respect to GSI, green stormwater infrastructure, and those types of things are a way for us to show our value of nature without having to have like a giant park in the middle of a city. But these small integrations bring back some of those benefits of nature without having to massively shift anything that's already gone on. So I think that's one way to think about the competition that we often think about between built environment and natural environment.
I don't really know where to begin. Development is such a charged word, and even I've always been puzzled by the fact that in English it means concrete, right? Like infrastructure, urbanization. In Spanish, it's not exactly the same. They're not synonym, and it's more like the process of increasing people's wealth or well-being. And yeah, I think it's very important to shift our focus from the means and the end, and really centered on what do we want, and if it's people's and nature's well-being, how do we get there, and what does that mean? And often it also means challenging the way we have been doing things and the whole global capital system. So it's a structural issue that it's hard to tackle because it's just so massive, right? Yeah, but finding those interstices, those spaces for complementarity and synergies between what we have now and making it more compatible with nature is really important. But I also think that the conversation about really shifting the focus on the current system that we have is also important, and challenging the very concept of development and the metrics that we usually use to measure it, like GDP, etc., and focus more on health and well-being, which is nothing new to this audience, right? But yeah, so battling, the battle from within the system, but also against the system at the same time.
One thing great, thanks. I'd like to build on that is question to you all, thinking about, like, one of my favorite things about this meeting is that we talk about things on a very large scale. Like, we have a lot of people from development banks here who are thinking about large loans for developing member countries. I'm using that word development a lot. And so we think about very large scale change. And then we have panels like this where we talk about community engaged research, and earlier panels where we talked about bright spots and amplifying seeds, like very small scale community engaged work of like transformational change happening at small scale that can't necessarily scale up. And so I'm wondering if you all can think about how those scales interact and have any words about what would be helpful from the sort of large scale transformative change in order to better enable water, fertilize those seeds of small scale community engaged work that is really pioneering the ways we need to change how we interact with our home planet.
Yeah. I can start, and then I'd love to hear from others, but I think for me, it's slowing down, and I think, everybody talks about speed and scale. It's sort of been the motto of our university since I've got here in 2022. It's almost everything moves at speed and scale, speed and scale. But I think we do need to slow down, and as you can see in all the presentations today, slow down and ask, who are we trying to benefit? When we think about sustainability, who are we trying to sustain for? And I think to ask those types of questions, you do have to stop and reflect and slow down a little bit, and really think deeply about that. And so I think for me, the answer to the question of, how does large scale, how do large scale sort of institutions think about small scale problems? I think it's stopping and shifting. And I think I said in my presentation, the best leverage that you have in any system is to really shift your mindset. And I think that shifting of mindset really requires you to sort of stop and think and slow down just a little bit, and then think about impact. And I think about time because yesterday I was giving a presentation similar to this one on community engagement for the Bay Area Pollution Protection Group. And one of the questions that I asked is, what is your barrier to doing community engaged work? And everybody said time and cost were their largest sort of barriers that popped up on the word cloud, which surprised me. I didn't think time and cost were things that really people struggled with. I thought it was more about thinking, I thought a huge barrier would be we don't know which communities to reach or how to reach them, but it was more about we don't have the time to do it, or the cost capacity to do it. And so for me, I think about it from a perspective of just slowing down just a little bit and not thinking in speed and scale, but thinking about people. But I'd love to hear from my other colleagues.
I can say, thinking about how I got into science. It's like all field work, and now I'm doing remote sensing, which obviously has this much broader spatial scale. And so oftentimes I'm trying to think about, when I have a new question, what's the best approach? Is it best for me to go in at this high level, or is it best for me to go in on this very plot-intensive approach? And I think both are valid, and it really depends on the context and the setting. And oftentimes when I'm doing plot-based work, when you want to publish, it's okay, you did something in this one site, what can you take from that that's relevant to other places that are maybe slightly different? So I think that's the way I think of these smaller community-based projects is, okay, there's something very specific that I'm working with this community on, but are there things that we can take away from this that we can use to motivate research or motivate progress in a different locale that may have similar context, similar things going on, but some unique differences that need to be integrated? So I think if we try to think much more strategically about these high-touch environments where we're working in one community, and really try and think, what are some things we can take away and share broadly, but it's based on that really in-the-trench research.
Either of you want to jump in, or we could also open up to the...
Yeah, maybe quickly to say that we understand now more about that systems or small scale is not disconnected from the larger scale. For a long time, things moved through trade to different places. So, there's now, I think, more frameworks that are able to help us think about scale in a way that beyond physical goods moving, and we talk about the impact of trade in a place, but now we can, through the same framework, we can study discourses. So how ideas in one place start to influence trade and affect ideas in another place. And I think that those things can go back and forth. So for me, small and big are linked in multiple hooks in a way that it's sometimes it's not even clear where the boundary is anymore. So there is and there are a lot of useful frameworks to help us to connect the scales in that way that have become quite useful. I think at least things like telecoupling. That I find it to be a very useful framework to think about connecting big and small scale. And I think there were a lot of presentations also through the week that were also showing how decisions about dietary choices in one place end up having massive impacts in very small particular places, either for biodiversity or for people living there. So I think these connections we're waking up to they're really showing this as not two separate systems anymore.
Yeah, I'm processing a lot of what y'all are saying, but I've always felt very comfortable working at the micro scale. Even the work at NatCap that was regional within Bolivia was massive scale for me. So that was very interesting and an awesome learning experience. And I'm thinking like the global or broader cross scale has always been in my mind because of the drivers, like you were saying, how processes happening in faraway places or at global scale really drive change at the smallest of scales, at the parcel level, at the household level. But then how, that's one direction. On the other direction, how do you uplift the experiences of agroforestry or producer to consumer experiences that are more sustainable and more just? I think that's always been a challenge, but probably fostering networks of exchange across those places to have lessons learned and some shared capacity and knowledge and start building those relationships might be one way to uplift those experiences, which doesn't mean to make them bigger, right? But to help them replicate and adapt and learn from one another.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from folks out there? Yeah, here.
First of all, thank you so much for this panel. It was really enlightening and really great to hear what everyone's doing. I think my question is still along the lines of scaling and thinking about knowledge sharing and communities of practice, where we can go to conferences and develop a community of practice, and that's also transferred in academic papers, which are highly specialized. And maybe your partners, it's not their responsibility to relay a lot of that information that could be used in other contexts. And so I'm wondering how you guys think about that knowledge transfer to people who aren't necessarily academics or experts, but it could be a metric for success in terms of that research getting picked up in other areas.
I can go ahead. I think that's a great question. I think it's really important to publish in the language of wherever you are working and in formats that are accessible for people, whether those are policy brief, reports, podcasts, whatever makes sense. And ideally, and it's not often the case that one has time to do that, you should think about those formats with people. And yeah, and I've learned from my time at NatCap also about how to do that, because I think that's very important in the approach to work with stakeholders to identify what those formats are, and maybe to integrate that information into tailored trainings and try to make sure that it comes to fruition or it has an impact beyond. Of course, then you can take it and publish it in English in a peer-reviewed journal whenever you have time, 3 years after you've finished the project. But I think it should be a priority to communicate first for the people you're working for and with.
Yeah, just to build off of that a little bit, I think that even the communication comes at scales, right? I think the larger scale of a lot of work that I do is to inform policy, and so seeing any of the information that I generate actually create policy that affects the communities directly is extremely important. At sort of the micro and sort of local scale, what we've done in our lab is anytime we publish a paper, we do a one-pager or we do an infographic that we can share back with the community. We make sure we do workshops and presentations post research so that we're conveying information back and what we did with that information. In one project recently, we created things like fridge magnets for people to understand their water bills and what their water bills are trying to convey. And so I think those little pieces in science communication are extremely important. But you do bring up a good question of, is that the responsibility of you as the researcher, or is it the responsibility of the community-based organization? But I think that's where a lot of what we talked about in terms of transparency and being collaborative and and co-producing is extremely important. I think those shared roles can be defined in things like partnership agreements, or they can be undefined and you discuss it as time comes on. But I do think that anything that we do develop or produce needs to go back to the communities and provide a benefit to the communities, not just for us to become tenured and well-known and speak at amazing conferences.
Time for one more. Adrienne.
I really liked the quote about, how can you come in and tell us what to do when you haven't even been here for 30 minutes? But I think there's also an assumption in a lot of our work that when you go work with a community, that this is a community that has lived in this place for many years, for generations. And that is true of many places in the world. However, we're also living in a time of massive displacement due to conflict, due to climate change, which is going to displace a lot more people. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to a little bit, the role of researchers, or how you feel your role could be in using these spaces that are created for community engagement to help bring in the recognitional justice, as Dr. Odi was saying, bringing in these voices of people who maybe have only been there 30 minutes, but they're likely to remain, and they're also, really important stakeholders in these places.
So for me, I think community is always a complicated thing, because everybody understands it to be different things. I understand it to be, if I'm talking about natural capital assessments, and I'm talking to that community of people, they are a community. They're not. It's not about the place that they're at. It's about the thing that they're doing. So in that sense, community means something different from attachment to place, so to speak. And so I'm not able to speak to the attachment to place community, and I think my colleagues are much more suited to speak to communities that are, in a sense, of people in a place, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a breadth of literature on sort of community engagement and displaced persons. I'm not an expert in that literature, but I do think of the example of Hurricane Katrina and the displacement that happened post-Hurricane Katrina and where people went. And a lot of literature that looks at that. I think it comes back to creating social fabrics, right? And creating cohesive social fabrics that communities have. I don't think those things disappeared based on location. I think you take those with you. And communities, in terms of resilience to things like natural disasters, and often rely on that social capital to survive and be more resilient. But I do think you're asking a great question about, how do we define community? And I don't think I have the best answer for that right now, or I don't think I'm suited to answer that question. But it is a great question. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so as a person who was displaced by Hurricane Katrina,
I was throwing you a softball.
Community is a lot more than just a physical geography, and that's something that I thought about, I guess, post-displacement. Community is whatever brings people together, and sometimes that's just a geography, sometimes it's you're all the fan of an artist and you're part of a community. And so kind of getting to what Odi is saying is, you may go into a community and the people that, let's say, come to your focus group are there because they all have an interest in the topic. And so now that's a community. They may come from different geographies, but they're all identifying themselves as, we all care about this thing very deeply enough to come to this place and talk about it. So I'm okay with community being kind of subjectively defined outside of geography. And so someone's length of time in a specific geography shouldn't be a demarcator of whether they have a right to engage or not. It may have some influence on the weight that you give their opinion, particularly if you're talking about something that is truly endemic to a specific place. So if someone just moved to a neighborhood and they're like, yeah, I've never seen any flooding here, but they only got there that year, then you may not put a lot behind what they're saying. But if someone has lived there for 45 years, like, yeah, every time it's a full moon, we get flooding, just making something up, then you might take what that person says more strongly. So community and whose kind of insights, feedback you take, you should listen to everything and kind of do some internal calculation of how much weight do you want to give that. And I think it's very context dependent, but it's not purely geographically linked unless the thing that you're interested in is heavily geographically linked.
Andrea, you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Adrian. Thank you. It might be a little bit tangential to the question, but it really made me think about, for example, in Bolivia and in many parts of the Amazon, I'm less familiar with other contexts, you have these very contentious processes of internal colonization where people are displaced, in the case of Bolivia, for example, from the highlands and are settling in the lowlands, but those lands are indigenous lands, so you have conflict there for land, but it's conflict among two marginalized groups. And what's not challenged in the country are some of the big interests of other stakeholders who monopolize land and et cetera. But there is an exclusion that comes with that too, because some of these groups of people are seen as pervasive actors who are encroaching on indigenous lands, but they are also human beings with complex realities, and they are often left out of the conversation or very easily put into categories and assumptions made about them. So your question just made me think of the importance of or choice of communities and who we work with and how do we engage with them and how do we challenge our own assumptions about people and these processes, because things are very complex and it's not either or. Sometimes it's this and that, right? And yeah.
I think that we will wrap up, I promise. But I think, Adrian, your question really brings up something for me that I've been thinking about, which is about that quote that you brought up about you've only been here for 30 minutes and now you're telling us what to do. I think we should never be telling anybody what to do. We need to be listening, and it's not sharing wisdom and knowledge when we're engaging with communities. It is listening. It's who are we developing for? Who are we doing this work for? For communities, no matter what scale at which we are working. So I think we just have to bring questions and listen way more than we're sharing our own ways of knowledge. So with that, thank you all so much for this and for listening.